My name is Rachel Morrison, and I'll never forget the moment my sister Melissa looked me dead in the eye at our cousin's engagement party and said, "You're just a soldier, Rachel. Stop acting like you're special." The words hit me like ice water, spoken loud enough for half the room to hear. Family members turned their heads, some looking away in embarrassment, others nodding slightly as if she'd finally said what they'd all been thinking. But I just smiled back at her, calm and steady, because I knew something she didn't. I knew that in 3 weeks, at this very same venue for her own wedding, she'd be standing frozen while the truth came crashing down around her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. To understand how we got to that moment, you need to know about the Morrison family dynamics and what it meant to be the younger sister in a house where achievement was measured in trophies and academic honors. I grew up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, in a 2-story colonial house with white shutters and a perfectly manicured lawn that my father mowed in diagonal stripes every Saturday morning. It was the kind of neighborhood where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on and parents gathered at baseball games with folding chairs and thermoses of coffee. My sister Melissa was everything our parents had ever dreamed of in a daughter. 3 years older than me, she excelled at everything she touched, straight A's from kindergarten through high school, captain of the debate team, student body president, and valedictorian of her graduating class. She had this way of commanding attention when she walked into a room, shoulders back, chin up, speaking with the kind of confidence that made adults nod approvingly and say things like, "That girl's going places." My parents, Susan and Robert Morrison, treated Melissa like she was made of gold. Dad, who managed the local bank, would beam with pride whenever anyone mentioned her latest achievement. Mom, a high school English teacher, would practically glow when other parents asked for advice on how to raise such an accomplished daughter. They'd display her awards on the mantle, frame her report cards, and bring up her accomplishments in casual conversations with neighbors and friends. Me? I was the afterthought, the second daughter who couldn't quite measure up to the standard Melissa had set. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't a troublemaker or a failure. I got decent grades, played on the softball team, had friends, but in a house where excellence was the baseline, decent felt like disappointment. When I brought home a B+, they'd ask why it wasn't an A. When I hit a double in softball, they'd wonder why I couldn't stretch it to a triple like Melissa used to do in track. The comparison was constant and exhausting. At family dinners, Melissa would regale us with stories of her latest academic triumph or leadership role, while I sat quietly cutting my pot roast into perfect squares, waiting for someone to ask about my day. They rarely did. Even when they tried to include me in the conversation, it usually came back to Melissa somehow. "Rachel, how was your history test? You know your sister always said Mr. Peterson was tough, but she managed to get an A in his class." By the time I was a sophomore in high school, I'd learned to carve out my own space in the shadows of Melissa's spotlight. I spent more time at friends' houses, stayed after school for extra practice, found reasons to be anywhere but home during the dinner hour praise sessions. It wasn't that my parents didn't love me, I think they did in their own way, but love got complicated when it was filtered through the lens of constant comparison. Melissa seemed to enjoy her role as the golden child. She'd ruffle my hair condescendingly when I struggled with math homework she'd mastered years earlier. She'd offer unsolicited advice about everything from my choice of friends to my hairstyle, always delivered with that tone that suggested she was doing me a favor by sharing her superior wisdom. When I showed interest in joining the ROTC program at school, she laughed and said, "Really, Rachel, that seems a bit dramatic, don't you think?" But there was something about the structure and discipline of ROTC that appealed to me. Maybe it was the clarity of expectations, the way achievement was measured by concrete standards rather than subjective comparisons to a perfect older sister. Maybe it was the camaraderie I found with other kids who, like me, were looking for something different than the traditional path everyone expected them to follow. Colonel Martinez, our ROTC instructor, was a former Marine who treated every cadet with the same straightforward respect. He didn't care that my sister was valedictorian or that my parents expected me to follow in her footsteps to the state university. He cared about effort, integrity, and commitment. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was being evaluated on my own merits rather than measured against someone else's achievements. I threw myself into ROTC with a passion that surprised everyone, including myself. I learned to march with precision, studied military history with genuine interest, and discovered that I had a natural aptitude for leadership that nobody had ever bothered to notice before. When I was selected as company commander in my junior year, I felt a pride that was entirely my own, unmarked by comparisons or qualifications. But even that achievement was diminished at home. When I announced my promotion at dinner, Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. Mom smiled tightly and said, "That's nice, honey," before immediately turning to Melissa to ask about her college application essays. Melissa herself offered a patronizing congratulations followed by, "I'm sure it'll look good on your college applications, even though most schools don't really care about that military stuff." The truth was, I wasn't planning on college, at least not right away. I'd been researching military options, drawn to the Navy and specifically to the special operations programs I'd read about in magazines and online forums. The idea of pushing myself beyond what anyone thought possible, of proving myself in ways that had nothing to do with grades or trophies or living up to someone else's expectations, felt like exactly what I needed. When I finally worked up the courage to tell my parents about my plans to enlist after graduation, the reaction was even worse than I'd expected. Dad actually laughed, a short dismissive sound that made my cheeks burn. "The military, Rachel, be serious, you're a Morrison, we don't join the military, we go to college." Mom tried to be more diplomatic, but her disappointment was obvious. "Sweetie, I know you've enjoyed ROTC, but don't you think you're being a little impulsive? College would give you so many more options." But it was Melissa's reaction that cut the deepest. She rolled her eyes and said, "God, Rachel, you're so dramatic, what's next? Are you going to shave your head and start doing push-ups in the backyard? You're not soldier material, you're barely athlete material." The words stung because part of me wondered if she was right. I wasn't the biggest or the strongest or the most naturally athletic person in my ROTC class. I had to work twice as hard as some of the guys just to keep up with the physical requirements. But what I lacked in natural ability, I made up for in determination. I'd learned to push through discomfort, to find strength I didn't know I had, to refuse to quit even when everything in my body was screaming at me to stop. That night, lying in my bed with Melissa's words echoing in my head, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let her doubt become my reality. I was going to prove that there was more to Rachel Morrison than anyone in my family had ever bothered to see. The next morning, I walked into the Navy recruiting office in downtown Cedar Falls. Petty Officer First Class Williams, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake, listened patiently as I explained my situation. I told her about ROTC, about my family's expectations, about my desire to prove myself in ways that went beyond anything I could accomplish in a college lecture hall. "What are you really looking for?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. "Because the Navy can give you a lot of things, but it can't give you your family's approval if that's not something they're willing to give." I thought about that for a long moment, staring at the recruitment posters on the wall showing sailors on ships and submarines, looking confident and capable and proud. "I'm looking for the chance to see what I'm actually made of," I said finally, without anyone else's expectations getting in the way. She nodded slowly. "Have you ever heard of the Navy SEALs?" I had, of course. Everyone had heard of the SEALs, the elite special operations force that represented the absolute pinnacle of military training and capability. But I'd assumed they were exclusively male, a world that would never be open to someone like me. "The Navy has been expanding opportunities for women in special operations," Petty Officer Williams explained. "It's not easy. The training is designed to break you, to find your absolute limit, and then push you past it. Most people who try don't make it, but for those who do, there's nothing else like it." She pulled out a folder thick with information about the SEAL program, the physical requirements, the mental challenges, the commitment required. As I flipped through the pages, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a sense of purpose that went beyond proving my family wrong. This was about discovering who I really was when everything else was stripped away. I spent weeks studying the requirements, training in secret, preparing my body and mind for what I knew would be the hardest challenge of my life. I ran miles in the pre-dawn darkness, while my family slept, did pull-ups on the playground equipment at the elementary school, swam laps at the community center pool, until the lifeguards started recognizing me as a regular. When I finally told my parents about my decision to pursue SEAL training, the reaction was swift and brutal. Dad called it a waste of potential, and completely unrealistic. Mom worried about my safety and my future, painting dire pictures of what military life would do to my chances of finding a husband and starting a family. But Melissa's response was the most dismissive of all. "SEALs," she laughed, not even bothering to look up from her laptop where she was working on her senior thesis. "Rachel, come on, be realistic. You couldn't even make varsity softball. You think you can handle the most elite military training in the world. You're just a regular person. Stop trying to be something you're not." Those words followed me all the way to boot camp at Great Lakes Naval Training Center, through the grueling months of preparation and evaluation that preceded SEAL training, and into the hellish weeks of basic underwater demolition SEAL training that pushed me to limits I never knew existed. Every time I wanted to quit, every time the instructors screamed in my face, or the physical demands seemed impossible, I heard Melissa's voice, "You're just a regular person." But what she'd meant as an insult became my motivation. Maybe I was just a regular person when I started, but regular people could do extraordinary things if they refused to accept limitations others placed on them. Regular people could become exceptional, through sheer force of will and commitment to never giving up. The day I graduated from SEAL training, earning my trident and the call sign Ironheart for my refusal to quit no matter how impossible the situation seemed, I thought about calling home to share the news. But I didn't. I knew they wouldn't understand the significance of what I'd accomplished. They'd see it as just another phase, another dramatic gesture from their disappointing younger daughter. Instead, I threw myself into my work with SEAL Team 3, deploying to places I couldn't talk about, doing things that would never make it into family dinner conversation. I learned to navigate by stars, to extract intelligence from hostile situations, to lead teams through complex operations where failure meant death. My call sign, Ironheart, became known and respected throughout the special operations community, though my family remained completely unaware of the world I now inhabited. I came home on leave periodically, usually for holidays or family celebrations, but I never talked about my work in any detail. When people asked what I did in the Navy, I'd give vague answers about special operations or classified assignments. Most people, including my family, seemed to assume I was exaggerating or trying to make my job sound more important than it was. Melissa, now working as a corporate lawyer in Chicago, would introduce me to her friends as my sister the soldier, always with a slight emphasis on the word that made it clear she found my career choice amusing rather than admirable. She'd gotten married to another lawyer in a ceremony that had been featured in the local newspaper, complete with photos of the happy couple and descriptions of their impressive educational credentials and career prospects. At family gatherings, the conversation inevitably centered around Melissa's latest professional triumph, or her husband's promotion at his law firm.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I'd sit quietly, listening to discussions about case law and corporate mergers, contributing little because there was nothing I could say about my actual work that wouldn't violate security protocols. The pattern continued for years. I'd come home, endure the subtle condescension and obvious disinterest in my career, and return to my team feeling like I was living a double life. My teammates knew me as Ironheart, a reliable operator who could be counted on to complete any mission regardless of the obstacles. My family knew me as Rachel, the younger daughter who'd chosen an unconventional path that they'd never quite understood or appreciated. The disconnect became most apparent during my nephew's birthday party when he was turning 8. All the kids at the party were fascinated by the fact that I was in the military and kept asking me questions about what I did. I tried to answer in age-appropriate ways, talking about teamwork and helping to keep people safe, but Melissa quickly shut down the conversation. "Rachel's job isn't really that exciting," she told the kids with a laugh. "She's just a soldier, it's not like the movies." Then she turned to me with that familiar condescending smile. "No offense, Resh, I just don't want the kids getting unrealistic ideas about military service." I wanted to tell her about the operations I'd led, about the lives I'd saved, about the respect I'd earned from some of the most elite warriors in the world. I wanted to explain that being just a soldier was actually something extraordinary, that the training I'd completed and the missions I'd undertaken represented achievements that went far beyond anything she'd accomplished in her comfortable corporate world. But I said nothing. I smiled and nodded and changed the subject. because that's what I'd learned to do. I carried the secret of my real identity like a weight in my chest, growing heavier with each dismissive comment and patronizing smile. It was around this time that Melissa announced her engagement to Marcus, a successful investment banker she'd met through work. The engagement party was planned for late spring at the Riverside Event Center in Cedar Falls, the same venue where they'd eventually hold their wedding. Everyone was invited: extended family, old friends, colleagues, all the people who'd watched Melissa excel throughout her life and who expected her marriage to be just another triumph to celebrate. I was stationed overseas during the planning stages, but I made arrangements to come home for the party. I hadn't seen the family in almost a year, and I was looking forward to a few days of normalcy, even if it meant enduring the usual subtle slights and dismissive comments about my career choice. The party was elegant, exactly what you'd expect from Melissa. String quartet playing in the corner, servers circulating with champagne and canapés, flowers arranged with professional precision. Melissa moved through the crowd like she was born for this moment, graciously accepting congratulations and showing off her engagement ring to anyone who asked. I wore my dress uniform, partly out of pride and partly because I knew it was one of the few times my family would see me representing the military in a formal capacity. Several people commented on how sharp I looked, and for a few moments, I felt like maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time they'd ask real questions about my service, show genuine interest in what I'd been doing with my life. But as the evening wore on, the familiar patterns reasserted themselves. Conversations would stop when I approached, not out of rudeness but because nobody really knew what to say to me. They'd ask generic questions about military life and nod politely at my generic answers, then quickly shift the conversation back to more relatable topics like careers and mortgages and children's schools. It was near the end of the party when it happened. I was standing near the dessert table, watching Melissa hold court with a group of her law school friends, when one of them asked about her family. She pointed me out across the room and said, loud enough for me to hear, "That's my sister Rachel. She's in the military. She thinks she's hot stuff because she got into some special training program, but honestly she's just a soldier. It's not like she's saving the world or anything." The group laughed politely, the kind of laughter that says they're not sure if they're supposed to find it funny but don't want to seem rude. One of them, a woman I didn't recognize, glanced in my direction with what might have been sympathy or curiosity. But it was what happened next that cut the deepest. An older man standing nearby, someone I recognized as a friend of my father's, chuckled and said, "Well, someone has to do those jobs, right? Can't all be lawyers and doctors." Melissa smiled at that, a bright, satisfied smile that said she'd successfully defined me in terms that everyone could understand and dismiss. "Exactly," she said. "Rachel's always been the dramatic one in the family. This is just her latest phase." I felt my face burn with anger and humiliation. Not because of the stranger's comment, but because my own sister had just reduced everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed and achieved, to a phase. Like my decision to pursue the most elite military training in the world was equivalent to a teenager's interest in punk rock or vegetarianism. But I didn't say anything. I couldn't say anything, not without revealing classified information about my actual role and achievements. So I smiled and nodded and excused myself to get some air, stepping out onto the venue's deck overlooking the Cedar River. I stood there in the darkness, listening to the water flow past and the muffled sounds of the party continuing inside, and made a decision. I wasn't going to keep carrying this secret much longer. Melissa was getting married in 3 weeks, right here at the same venue, and she'd invited everyone she wanted to impress. Military colleagues, law school friends, professional contacts, family members who'd watched her succeed her entire life. I had some leave time coming, and I'd been planning to attend the wedding anyway, but now I had a different kind of plan forming in my mind. I thought about the people I'd served with, the commanders who knew my real story, the teammates who'd seen me at my best and worst. I thought about the Navy's Public Affairs Office, and the protocols for acknowledging special operations achievements when appropriate. And I thought about the look on Melissa's face when she finally learned who her just-a-soldier sister really was. The next 3 weeks passed slowly. I was back at my base, going through the motions of training and preparation for my next deployment, but my mind kept drifting to the wedding and what I was planning. It wasn't about revenge, exactly, it was about truth. About finally having the moment when my real identity could speak for itself, when the years of dismissal and condescension would be revealed for what they really were. I made some phone calls, sent some emails, had some conversations with people whose opinions carried weight in the special operations community. I wasn't asking for anything inappropriate or seeking to violate any protocols. I was simply ensuring that when the time came, the truth would be presented in a way that left no room for doubt or dismissal. Captain Rodriguez, my commanding officer, understood what I was dealing with. He'd grown up in a military family where service was respected and understood, but he'd worked with enough operators who came from civilian backgrounds to recognize the challenges we faced. When I explained the situation, he nodded thoughtfully and said, "Sometimes family members need to hear certain things from someone other than us. Let me make some calls." The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. During the wedding reception, when toasts were being given and attention was focused on celebrating the happy couple, there would be a special presentation recognizing my service. Nothing that would violate operational security, nothing that would steal attention from Melissa's big day, but something that would finally reveal the truth about who I really was and what I'd accomplished. I flew home 2 days before the wedding, staying at a hotel rather than with my parents to avoid the inevitable questions and conversations that would only complicate what I was planning. I attended the rehearsal dinner, smiled and made small talk, played the role of the supportive sister who was happy to see Melissa achieving another milestone. But underneath the pleasant facade, I was counting down the hours until the truth would finally come to light. The morning of Melissa's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect weather that wedding planners pray for, and brides take as a sign that everything is going according to plan. The ceremony was scheduled for late afternoon at St. Michael's Catholic Church, followed by a reception at the Riverside Event Center, where the engagement party had been held. I spent the morning alone, going for a long run along the river trail, and then having coffee at a small cafe downtown, where nobody would recognize me or want to make conversation about family dynamics. I was nervous, but not about what I was planning. I was nervous about how it would change things, whether the revelation would bring my family closer together or drive us further apart. By the time I arrived at the church, the parking lot was already full of cars, and the sidewalk was busy with guests making their way inside. I wore my dress uniform again, partly because it was appropriate for a formal wedding, and partly because I wanted to honor the service that had shaped me into who I'd become. The ceremony itself was beautiful, exactly what Melissa had always dreamed of. She looked radiant in her wedding dress, and Marcus seemed genuinely happy and proud to be marrying her. During the exchange of vows, I found myself thinking about partnership and commitment, about the different ways people choose to build lives together. When the ceremony ended, and we all moved to the reception venue, I felt the familiar weight of anticipation settling in my chest. The cocktail hour passed in a blur of small talk, and catching up with relatives I hadn't seen in months. Several people commented on my uniform, asking the usual polite questions about military service that I'd learned to answer with practiced vagueness. Dinner was served as the sun began to set over the river, casting golden light through the venue's large windows. I sat at a table with cousins and family friends, participating in conversations about jobs and kids and local news, while my mind focused on what was coming next. After the main course was cleared, and before the cake cutting, the DJ announced that there would be a special presentation. I felt my heart rate increase as a man in Navy dress uniform approached the microphone. Commander Jackson was someone I'd never met personally, but Captain Rodriguez had arranged for him to come from the Regional Navy Public Affairs Office to make the presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Commander Jackson began, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet reception hall. "Before we continue with this wonderful celebration, I have the honor of recognizing someone very special who is here with us tonight." I saw Melissa turn in her chair, looking confused but still smiling, probably assuming this was some kind of surprise her new husband had arranged. The rest of the room focused their attention on Commander Jackson, curious but not yet understanding what was about to happen. Naval Special Warfare operates in environments and situations that most people can't imagine, Commander Jackson continued. The men and women who serve in these elite units represent the absolute best of our military, individuals who have proven themselves capable of extraordinary achievements under the most challenging circumstances possible. The room remained quiet, but I could see people beginning to look around, trying to figure out why a Navy commander was making this presentation at a wedding reception. A few guests glanced in my direction, making connections but not yet understanding their significance. Tonight I have the privilege of recognizing Petty Officer First Class Rachel Morrison, call sign Ironheart, for her exceptional service as a member of SEAL Team 3. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I heard gasps from various parts of the room, saw heads turning, as people tried to process what they'd just heard. But it was the expressions on my family's faces that I'll remember for the rest of my life. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock, and something that might have been pride. My father leaned forward in his chair, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, but it was Melissa's face that captured the moment perfectly. Her mouth fell open, her carefully applied makeup, unable to hide the complete shock that transformed her features. Call sign Ironheart was earned through demonstrated courage, leadership, and an absolute refusal to quit under circumstances that would break most people. Commander Jackson continued. Petty Officer Morrison has completed multiple classified deployments, led high-risk operations, and earned the respect of her teammates and commanders through her exceptional performance in some of the most demanding situations our military faces. He paused, allowing the words to sink in before continuing. In recognition of her service and the honor she has brought to naval special warfare, I'm pleased to present Petty Officer Morrison with the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, and to announce her selection for promotion to Chief Petty Officer, effective immediately. The applause started slowly, then built as people began to understand what they were witnessing. But I was focused on my family, watching as years of assumptions and dismissals crumbled in the face of undeniable truth. I stood and walked to the front of the room, my legs steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. Commander Jackson pinned the medal to my uniform and shook my hand, speaking quietly, so only I could hear. Your commanding officer wanted you to know that you've made everyone in the teams proud. This recognition is long overdue. When I turned to face the room, the applause was thunderous. People were standing, clapping, some of them calling out congratulations. But my eyes went immediately to Melissa, who remained seated, staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or resentment, it was something closer to bewilderment, as if everything she thought she knew about the world had suddenly shifted. The presentation concluded, and people began to approach me, offering congratulations and asking questions I could finally answer with pride instead of evasion. Cousins I'd barely spoken to in years wanted to know about my training and deployments. Family friends who'd known me since childhood looked at me with new respect and curiosity. But it was my father who reached me first. He walked up slowly, his usually confident posture subdued, his eyes fixed on the medal now pinned to my chest. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Rachel," he said, and then stopped, as if he wasn't sure how to continue. "I had no idea. I knew you were in the Navy, but I didn't understand, I didn't know what you'd accomplished." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. There was too much emotion churning in my chest, too many years of hurt and disappointment finally being acknowledged. "I'm proud of you," he said finally. "I should have been proud of you all along, but I didn't know how to see past my own expectations. I'm sorry for that." My mother appeared beside him, tears streaming down her face. She pulled me into a hug that felt different from any embrace she'd given me before, tighter and more genuine, as if she was hugging the real me for the first time. "My daughter," she whispered against my ear, "my brave, incredible daughter, I'm so sorry we didn't understand. I'm so sorry we didn't see who you really were." The moment was interrupted by Marcus, Melissa's new husband, who approached with a mixture of awe and embarrassment on his face. "Rachel, I owe you an apology," he said. "We all do. I had no idea about your service, about what you'd achieved. Thank you for what you do for our country." But it was Melissa I was waiting for. She approached slowly, her wedding dress rustling softly against the floor, her face still showing traces of the shock that had transformed her earlier. When she reached me, she stood there for a long moment, just looking at me as if trying to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the person who'd just been honored in front of everyone she wanted to impress. "Ironheart," she said finally, and her voice was different. Smaller somehow, lacking the confident authority I'd grown up listening to. That's really your call sign. I nodded. Earned it during training. The instructors said I had an iron heart, because I refused to quit, no matter how bad things got. She was quiet for another moment, then said, I called you just a soldier. You did. I was wrong. The words came out quietly, almost a whisper. I was wrong about everything. I thought I knew who you were, thought I understood what your choices meant, but I didn't know anything at all. The conversation could have continued, could have turned into a longer discussion about family dynamics, and missed opportunities and the ways we'd all failed to really see each other. But this was her wedding day, and despite everything that had happened between us, I didn't want to overshadow what should have been her moment of celebration. It's okay, I said, and meant it. Today is about you and Marcus. Let's focus on that. But she shook her head. No, it's not okay. I spent years dismissing you, making you feel small, acting like your choices didn't matter. And all this time, you were out there doing things I can't even imagine, earning respect I never bothered to give you. She paused, looking around the room where people were still processing what they'd learned, still approaching to offer congratulations, and ask questions about my service. I need to apologize, Rachel, not just for tonight, but for all of it. For all the times I made you feel like you weren't enough, like what you were doing didn't matter. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. The apology meant more than I'd expected it to. Not because I needed her validation anymore. I'd learned to find my own worth and pride through my service, and the respect of my teammates, but because it represented a kind of honesty that had been missing from our relationship for years. Thank you, I said. That means a lot. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of conversations and congratulations. People wanted to know about SEAL training, about what it was like being one of the few women in such an elite unit, about the deployments and operations I could discuss without violating security protocols. For the first time in my adult life, I felt seen and understood by my family and the community I'd grown up in. Later that night, after the last guest had left, and the venue was being cleaned up, I found myself standing on the same deck where I'd made my decision 3 weeks earlier. The river flowed past in the darkness, carrying away the day's emotions and revelations. Melissa appeared beside me, having changed out of her wedding dress into more comfortable clothes. We stood there in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us processing everything that had happened. I used to think success looked like my life, she said eventually. Good grades, prestigious job, nice house, respectable husband. I thought that was the only way to make something of yourself. I nodded, understanding what she was trying to say. But watching you tonight, seeing the respect people showed you, understanding what you've actually accomplished, I realize I had a very narrow definition of success. And I probably missed out on really knowing my sister, because I was too busy judging her choices instead of trying to understand them. We all make choices based on what makes sense to us at the time, I said. You followed a path that worked for you, that made you happy. There's nothing wrong with that. But there was something wrong with the way I treated you because you chose differently. She turned to face me directly. I want to do better, Rachel. I want to be the kind of sister who supports you instead of dismissing you, who asks about your life instead of assuming I already know everything about it. It was a conversation I'd never expected to have with Melissa, an acknowledgement of patterns that had shaped our relationship for decades. The revelation about my service hadn't just changed how other people saw me, it had given us both permission to see each other differently. I'd like that, I said. We talked for another hour, sharing stories and perspectives we'd never bothered to exchange before. She told me about the pressures she'd felt to excel, about the weight of always being the golden child, and the fear that any failure would disappoint everyone. I told her about the loneliness of carrying secrets about my work, about the satisfaction of pushing myself beyond what I thought possible, about the brotherhood I'd found with my teammates. By the time we parted that night, something fundamental had shifted between us, not just because of the public recognition or the apologies, but because we'd finally seen each other as complete people rather than the limited roles we'd been playing in each other's lives. The next few days passed quietly, as I prepared to return to my base and my team. Family members continued to reach out, wanting to express their pride and ask questions about my service. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate my parents on having raised such an accomplished daughter. The local newspaper even ran a small article about my recognition, complete with a photo of me in dress uniform, receiving the medal. But the conversation that mattered most happened the morning before I left, when my father asked if we could take a walk together. We ended up at the same riverfront park, where I used to run during high school, following the trail I'd used to train for SEAL selection without anyone knowing what I was preparing for. I keep thinking about all the times you tried to tell us about your work, and we didn't listen, he said as we walked. All the opportunities we had to be proud of you, to support what you were doing, and we missed them because we were too focused on what we thought your life should look like. I appreciated his honesty, but I also understood the position my secrecy had put them in. A lot of what I do can't be discussed, even with family. I couldn't exactly come home and talk about classified operations over dinner. But we could have asked better questions. We could have tried to understand instead of dismissing. We could have shown interest in you as a person instead of just comparing you to Melissa all the time. He stopped walking and turned to face me. I want you to know that I'm proud of you, Rachel. Not just because of the medal or the promotion, but because of who you've become. The strength and integrity and commitment you've shown, that comes from inside you. That's who you've always been, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. It was the conversation I'd been waiting for my entire life, the recognition and respect I'd craved as a child, and learned to live without as an adult. Hearing it now, when I no longer needed it for my own sense of self-worth, made it even more meaningful. Thank you, I said. That means everything to me. When I returned to my base, my teammates greeted me with the kind of good-natured ribbing that passes for affection in the special operations community. Word had gotten around about the wedding presentation, and they found it hilarious that their teammate had become a local celebrity at a wedding reception. Chief Petty Officer Davis, who'd been my swim buddy during training, slapped me on the back and said, "Ironheart goes home and becomes the belle of the ball. Who would have thought?" But beneath the joking, there was genuine respect for what I'd accomplished, not just in the teams but in navigating the complex relationship between my military identity and my civilian family. Several of my teammates had dealt with similar situations, trying to explain their service to family members who couldn't begin to understand the reality of special operations work. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, one of the few other women in our unit, pulled me aside during our next briefing. "I heard about your wedding situation," she said quietly. "How does it feel to finally have your family see the real you?" It was a complicated question. On one level, it felt incredible to finally be recognized for who I really was, to see the shock and respect on my family's faces when they learned about my service. But on another level, it raised uncomfortable questions about why external validation had mattered so much to me, and whether I'd truly moved beyond needing their approval, or if some part of me was still that little girl desperate to impress her parents and older sister. "It feels good," I said finally. "But it also makes me realize how much energy I wasted over the years worrying about what they thought. I should have been confident in my own achievements regardless of whether they understood them." Commander Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Family dynamics are complicated. We can intellectually know that we don't need their approval, but emotionally it still affects us. The important thing is that you stayed true to yourself and your commitments, regardless of whether they recognized it or not." She was right, but the conversation stayed with me as I prepared for my next deployment. I'd achieved what I'd always wanted, the respect and recognition from my family that I'd craved since childhood. But now, I had to figure out how to build a relationship with them based on mutual understanding rather than the old patterns of dismissal and defiance. The deployment itself was intense, involving operations in a region I can't name against targets I can't describe. What I can say is that it tested everything I'd learned about leadership, tactical planning, and mental resilience. Leading a team through complex missions where split-second decisions could mean the difference between success and catastrophe required a level of focus and confidence that I'd been building since my first day in SEAL training. My call sign Ironheart took on deeper meaning during those months overseas. It wasn't just about refusing to quit during training exercises or pushing through physical pain. It was about maintaining composure under pressure, making clear decisions when chaos surrounded us, and never losing sight of the mission objectives regardless of how dangerous or complicated the situation became. During one particularly challenging operation, our team was tasked with gathering intelligence from a compound that intelligence reports suggested was being used by high-value targets. The insertion went smoothly, but once we were on the ground, everything changed. The compound was more heavily defended than expected, and what should have been a quick reconnaissance mission turned into a sustained engagement that lasted most of the night. I found myself in command when our team leader was injured during the initial contact, and for the next 6 hours I had to coordinate our movements, manage our ammunition and equipment, and make tactical decisions that would determine whether my team made it home safely. The training I'd received, both in formal military education and through years of experience with the teams, kicked in automatically. But what carried me through wasn't just technical knowledge, it was the mental toughness I'd developed through years of proving myself in situations where failure wasn't an option. When we finally extracted successfully, with the intelligence we'd been sent to gather and all team members accounted for, Lieutenant Commander Martinez, who'd taken command after being treated for his injuries, pulled me aside. "Outstanding work, Chief," he said. "Your leadership under fire was textbook perfect. More importantly, you kept your team together and focused when things went sideways. That's the kind of performance that separates good operators from great ones." The praise meant more than any family recognition could have because it came from people who understood exactly what had been required and how difficult it had been to execute. These were operators who had seen the best and worst of special operations performance, and their respect was earned through demonstrated competence under the most demanding circumstances possible. When I returned from deployment, I had accumulated enough leave time to spend a few weeks at home in Cedar Falls. The dynamic with my family had shifted dramatically since the wedding, but we were all still learning how to navigate our new understanding of each other. My parents had started following military news more closely, asking informed questions about my service and showing genuine interest in understanding the world I inhabited professionally. My father had even joined a support group for military families, wanting to better understand the challenges faced by family members of service personnel. The change in my mother was perhaps the most dramatic. She'd always been proud of Melissa's achievements, but now she seemed to understand that there were different ways to serve and different definitions of success. She'd started volunteering at a local veterans organization, helping with administrative tasks and learning about the resources available to returning service members. But it was the evolution of my relationship with Melissa that surprised me the most. She'd made a genuine effort to understand my world, reading books about special operations, watching documentaries about military training, and asking thoughtful questions about my experiences. More importantly, she'd begun to see me as an individual with my own accomplishments, rather than just the younger sister who'd chosen an unconventional path. During one of our conversations, she told me about a discussion she'd had with her colleagues at the law firm. "I was talking about you at work," she said, "telling them about your service and what you've accomplished. One of the partners asked if you'd be interested in speaking to our clients about leadership and crisis management. Apparently, what you do translates to skills that business executives are very interested in learning about." The invitation itself wasn't what mattered. It was the fact that Melissa now saw my military experience as something valuable that could be shared and respected in her professional world. She was proud to tell people about my service, which represented a complete reversal from the dismissive attitude she'd maintained for years. We also talked more openly about our childhood and the family dynamics that had shaped both of us. Melissa admitted that she'd felt pressure to be perfect, to maintain the golden child status that had defined her identity for so long. "I think I resented you sometimes because you seemed free to make choices I would never have been allowed to make," she said. "If I had announced I was joining the military instead of going to college, it would have been seen as a complete failure. But somehow you were able to break free from those expectations." It was an insight that helped me understand her perspective in a way I never had before. Her dismissive attitude toward my choices hadn't just been about superiority or condescension, it had been partly about her own constraints and the different pressures we'd faced as daughters with different roles in the family hierarchy. "I never felt free," I told her. "I felt like I was fighting against everyone's expectations, including my own doubts about whether I was capable of succeeding in something as demanding as special operations. The military gave me structure and clear standards for success, but it wasn't an escape from pressure, it was just a different kind of pressure." These conversations helped us build a relationship based on mutual understanding, rather than the old patterns of competition and comparison. We were both accomplished women who had chosen different paths to success, and for the first time, we could appreciate each other's achievements without feeling threatened or diminished. The real test of our changed relationship came when I received orders for another deployment, this one longer and more dangerous than previous assignments. I was being assigned to a joint task force working in a region where special operations personnel faced significant risks and where communication with family would be extremely limited. When I told my family about the deployment, their reactions were completely different from what I'd experienced in the past. Instead of dismissive comments about military life or questions about when I'd settle down and choose a more conventional career, they expressed genuine concern for my safety and pride in my continued service. My father asked thoughtful questions about the preparation and training I'd be receiving. My mother wanted to know about communication protocols and how often I'd be able to contact home, but it was Melissa's response that moved me the most. "I know you can't tell us much about what you'll be doing," she said, "but I want you to know that I'll be thinking about you every day. I'm proud of you, Rachel. I'm proud of the woman you've become and the service you've chosen. I wish it had taken me this long to understand that, but I'm grateful I finally do." The deployment lasted 8 months, and it was the most challenging assignment of my career. Leading teams through operations that pushed the boundaries of what special operations forces are capable of accomplishing, working with international partners whose training and procedures were different from our own, and adapting to threats that evolved constantly throughout our time in the field. During those months, I thought often about the journey that had brought me to this point. From the insecure younger sister desperate for family approval to the confident special operations leader trusted with the most sensitive missions our military undertakes. The recognition I'd received at Melissa's wedding had been important, but it wasn't what had made me who I was. That had come from years of pushing myself beyond what I thought possible, of earning the respect of teammates who demanded excellence, and of learning to find pride and purpose in service rather than in external validation. The letters I received from home during the deployment reflected the changed dynamic with my family. My parents wrote regularly, sharing news from Cedar Falls but also expressing their pride in my service and their confidence in my abilities. Melissa sent care packages filled with books, coffee, and handwritten notes that showed she'd been thinking about me and the challenges I was facing. But perhaps the most meaningful correspondence came from my nephew Melissa's son, who was now old enough to understand that his aunt was serving overseas in a dangerous place. His drawings and letters filled with childish enthusiasm for Aunt Rachel the Navy SEAL reminded me that the impact of my service extended beyond my own sense of accomplishment. I was representing something important to the next generation, showing them that conventional expectations could be challenged and that service to something larger than yourself was a worthy choice. When I finally returned from deployment, the homecoming was different from any I'd experienced before. My family was waiting at the airport, holding signs and wearing shirts that showed their pride in my service. Seeing my parents and Melissa openly celebrating my return, watching my nephew run toward me with excitement about his hero aunt, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong and everything to do with being fully accepted for who I was. The months that followed were a period of readjustment and reflection. I was assigned to a training role, sharing my operational experience with newer SEAL candidates and helping to develop the next generation of special operations personnel. It was satisfying work that allowed me to use everything I'd learned while contributing to the continuous improvement of our training programs. During this period, I also began speaking publicly about military service and women in special operations. The Navy had begun to recognize the value of having experienced female operators share their stories, both to encourage other women to consider special operations careers and to help civilian audiences understand the evolving nature of military service. My first speaking engagement was at a leadership conference in Des Moines, just a few hours from Cedar Falls. Melissa drove down to attend, bringing our parents and several family friends who wanted to hear me speak. Watching them in the audience as I discussed the challenges and rewards of special operations service, seeing their faces filled with pride and interest, I realized that we'd come full circle from the days when my career choice was seen as a disappointing deviation from family expectations. After the presentation, during the question and answer session, a young woman in the audience asked about dealing with family members who don't understand or support military service choices. It was a question I'd been asked before, and one that resonated with my own experience. Family relationships are complicated, I told her. Sometimes the people closest to us have difficulty understanding choices that are outside their own experience or expectations. But authenticity matters more than approval. If you're confident in your path and committed to serving something larger than yourself, that conviction will eventually be recognized, even by people who initially doubt or dismiss your choices. I looked at my family in the audience as I continued. It took years for my family to understand my service, and there were times when their lack of understanding was painful. But staying true to my commitments and continuing to grow professionally eventually created opportunities for them to see who I really was. The recognition came, but more importantly, I learned that my worth wasn't dependent on their understanding. The young woman nodded thoughtfully, and I could see that the answer had resonated with her. After the event, she approached me with questions about SEAL training and the application process for special operations programs. Her determination and enthusiasm reminded me of myself at her age, ready to prove that conventional limitations didn't apply to someone willing to work hard enough to overcome them. Later that evening, over dinner with my family, we talked about the presentation and the questions from the audience. My father mentioned that several of his friends at the bank had attended and had been impressed by my speaking ability and the stories I'd shared about leadership under pressure. "You know," he said, "when you first told us you were joining the military, I thought you were running away from responsibility. I didn't understand that you were actually running toward it, toward a level of responsibility and challenge that most people never experience." My mother added, "I used to worry that military life would make you hard, that you'd lose the qualities that made you our daughter. But listening to you speak tonight, I realized that service has actually made you more of who you were always meant to be. Stronger, yes, but also more compassionate and more confident." It was Melissa who offered the observation that meant the most to me. "I've been thinking about what you said during the question and answer session, about authenticity mattering more than approval. I realized that I spent years trying to get approval for choices that were safe and conventional, while you were being authentic to values and commitments that were much more demanding. In the end, your path required more courage than mine did." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics we'd never discussed openly before. We talked about family expectations and individual identity, about the different ways people choose to contribute to their communities, and about the importance of supporting each other's choices, even when they're difficult to understand. Over the following months, I continued speaking at events around the country, sharing my experience with audiences ranging from high school students to corporate executives. Each presentation was an opportunity to discuss the values and skills developed through military service, but also to address the broader themes of perseverance, leadership, and the importance of pursuing challenging goals, even when others doubt your capabilities. The speaking engagements also provided opportunities to spend time with my family, who often attended events when they were held within driving distance of Iowa. Seeing them in these professional settings, watching them interact with other audience members, and answer questions about my service, I was struck by how completely our relationship had transformed. They'd become advocates for military service and vocal supporters of women in special operations. My father had started mentoring young people in Cedar Falls who were interested in military careers, sharing what he'd learned about the application processes and training programs. My mother had become involved with organizations supporting military families, using her teaching background to help with educational programs for military children. But perhaps the most significant change was in Melissa, who had begun incorporating discussions of military service and veterans' issues into her legal practice. She'd started volunteering with organizations that provided legal services to veterans, and she'd become an expert in the legal challenges faced by returning service members. "Working with veterans has taught me so much about service and sacrifice," she told me during one of our regular phone calls. "I used to think success was about individual achievement, about building a career and accumulating accomplishments. But spending time with people who've served has shown me that the most meaningful success comes from contributing to something larger than yourself." It was a profound evolution in her thinking, one that had grown directly from her changed understanding of my service. The sister who had once dismissed my career as just being a soldier now saw military service as one of the highest forms of civic engagement. The recognition I'd received at her wedding had been the catalyst for change, but the real transformation had come through months and years of honest conversation, shared experiences, and mutual effort to understand each other's perspectives. We'd built a relationship based on respect and admiration rather than competition and comparison. As I prepared for my next assignment, another deployment that would take me away from family for an extended period, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The young woman who had walked into that Navy recruiting office years ago, desperate to prove herself to a family that didn't understand her choices, had become someone who no longer needed external validation to feel confident in her path. But more importantly, that journey had led to genuine connection with family members who now saw me clearly and supported me fully. The approval I'd once craved had eventually come, not because I'd demanded it or forced a confrontation, but because I'd remained authentic to my values and committed to my service, regardless of whether anyone understood or appreciated it. The night before I left for my next deployment, my family gathered for dinner at our parents' house. It was a simple meal, the kind of family gathering that had once been tense with unspoken disappointments and comparisons. But now it was filled with warmth and genuine connection. My nephew, now old enough to understand that his aunt would be gone for many months, presented me with a drawing he'd made of a Navy SEAL conducting a mission. The details were impressively accurate for a child his age, and when I asked him where he'd learned so much about special operations, he grinned and pointed at his mother. "Mom's been teaching me about your job," he said.
She says you're a hero, and that you help keep people safe. Is that true? Before I could answer, Melissa spoke up. Your Aunt Rachel is one of the bravest people I know, she said, her voice filled with pride. She does things that most people can't even imagine, and she does them to protect all of us. Yes, she's definitely a hero. Looking around the table at my family, seeing the love and respect in their faces, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us together. The recognition at the wedding had been important, but this quiet moment of connection was what really mattered. We'd found our way to genuine understanding and mutual support. As I prepared to return to the most demanding and dangerous work of my career, I carried with me not just my training and experience, but also the knowledge that I was supported by people who truly saw and appreciated who I was. The girl who had once been dismissed as just a soldier had become a woman whose service was honored and whose family had learned to see military excellence as one of the highest forms of achievement. The journey from dismissal to recognition had taken years, but it had been worth every difficult moment, not because external validation was necessary for my self-worth, but because it had created the foundation for relationships based on truth and mutual respect. And in the end, that was more valuable than any medal or promotion could ever be. The deployment that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in my career. Our task force was operating in conditions that required not just tactical excellence but also diplomatic sensitivity, working alongside international partners whose capabilities and procedures varied dramatically from our own. As the senior enlisted advisor for the combined operations, I found myself in situations where my decisions affected not just the success of individual missions but also the broader strategic relationships between allied nations. The responsibility was immense, but so was the satisfaction of applying everything I'd learned about leadership, cultural awareness, and operational planning. Leading multinational teams through complex operations required skills that went far beyond the tactical training we'd received. It demanded cultural intelligence, linguistic adaptability, and the kind of diplomatic awareness that comes only from years of experience working with diverse groups under pressure. During one particularly challenging period, our task force was assigned to coordinate with local forces in a region where tribal loyalties and political affiliations created a constantly shifting landscape of alliances and potential threats. My role was to serve as the primary liaison, building relationships with local commanders, while ensuring that our operational objectives remained achievable despite the complex political environment. The work required patience and cultural sensitivity that I'd developed through previous deployments, but it also demanded a level of strategic thinking that pushed me beyond my previous experience. I was no longer just executing missions planned by others. I was helping to develop the strategic framework within which those missions would be conducted. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who was serving as my counterpart from the Air Force Special Operations community, became both a colleague and a mentor during this deployment. He'd spent 25 years in special operations, working in every major conflict zone since the early 1990s, and his perspective on leadership and international cooperation was invaluable. "You've got something that can't be taught," he told me during one of our planning sessions. "You understand that successful operations aren't just about tactical execution, they're about building relationships and maintaining trust. That kind of strategic awareness is what separates good operators from the ones who get promoted to positions where they can really make a difference. His assessment was gratifying, but more importantly, it helped me understand how my experiences with family dynamics and the challenge of proving myself in skeptical environments had actually prepared me for this kind of diplomatic work. Learning to navigate complex relationships, to earn trust from people who initially doubted my capabilities, and to maintain professionalism in the face of dismissal or condescension turned out to be excellent preparation for international coalition building. The months overseas also gave me perspective on how much my relationship with my family had evolved. The regular communication I maintained with home was filled with genuine interest and support rather than the polite distance that had characterized our interactions for years. My parents asked informed questions about the regions where I was working, and Melissa had begun following international news more closely so she could better understand the context of my assignments. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the way my family had begun to see military service as part of a broader commitment to public service and civic engagement. My father had started volunteering with local veterans organizations, using his banking background to help with financial counseling for returning service members. My mother had expanded her work with military families to include advocacy for better educational resources and support programs. Melissa had made the most dramatic change, incorporating veterans' legal issues into her practice and becoming involved with policy advocacy at the state level. She'd testified before legislative committees about the challenges faced by returning service members, and she'd started working with other lawyers to provide pro bono legal services for veterans dealing with disability claims, housing issues, and family law matters. I never understood before how military service continues to affect people long after they leave active duty, she wrote in one of her emails. Working with veterans has shown me that the commitment you made when you enlisted was really a lifetime commitment to serving others. I'm proud to be able to support that service in my own way. Reading her words from thousands of miles away, surrounded by the constant demands of operational planning and international coordination, I felt a deep sense of connection to family that transcended physical distance. We'd found common ground in our shared commitment to service, even though that service took very different forms. The deployment also reinforced my understanding of why the recognition at Melissa's wedding had been so important, not just for my relationship with my family, but for my own sense of identity. For years I'd carried the weight of living a double life, being Ironheart to my teammates and just Rachel to my family. That divided existence had created a constant tension between my professional accomplishments and my personal relationships. The public recognition had eliminated that division, allowing me to be fully myself in all environments. When I spoke with family members now, I could share appropriate details about my work and receive informed responses that showed they understood the significance of what I was doing. The conversation was no longer filtered through assumptions about military service being somehow lesser than civilian accomplishments. This integration of identity proved crucial during the most challenging operation of the deployment. Our task force was assigned to conduct a complex extraction mission in a region where diplomatic relations had deteriorated rapidly, requiring us to operate with minimal support from traditional intelligence networks and political infrastructure. The mission required not just tactical precision but also cultural understanding and diplomatic sensitivity. We were working in an environment where a single mistake could have strategic consequences far beyond the immediate operational objectives. Success depended on our ability to build trust with local contacts while maintaining operational security and adapting to rapidly changing political conditions. As the senior enlisted leader, I was responsible for coordinating between the tactical teams executing the mission and the strategic planners managing its broader implications. It was the kind of role that required complete confidence in my own judgment and the ability to communicate clearly with personnel at every level of the command structure. The operation ultimately succeeded, but not without moments when split-second decisions determined whether we would achieve our objectives or face a strategic disaster. Leading teams through that kind of high-stakes environment required every skill I'd developed throughout my career, from the tactical proficiency learned in SEAL training to the diplomatic awareness gained through years of international operations. When we completed the mission successfully, the sense of accomplishment was profound.
Not just because we'd achieved difficult tactical objectives, but because we'd done so while maintaining the international relationships and strategic partnerships that made such operations possible. It was the kind of success that demonstrated how individual competence contributes to broader national security objectives. Colonel Matthews, the task force commander, called me into his office the day after the operation concluded. "Chief Morrison," he said, "I've been in special operations for 15 years, and I've rarely seen someone handle complex leadership challenges with the kind of maturity and strategic awareness you demonstrated during this mission." He paused, looking at the mission report spread across his desk. "I'm recommending you for the Joint Service Commendation Medal, and I'm also submitting paperwork for your selection to attend the Senior Enlisted Academy. Your performance here has shown that you're ready for senior leadership roles that will take you well beyond tactical operations." The recognition was meaningful, but what mattered more was the understanding that my career had reached a point where I could contribute to strategic decision-making and policy development. The path from that young woman who'd walked into a Navy recruiting office to prove her family wrong had led to positions where my experience and judgment could influence operations affecting national security and international relations. As the deployment wound down and I prepared to return home, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The recognition at Melissa's wedding had been a turning point, but it wasn't the destination. It had been the moment when my two worlds finally merged, when my family identity and my professional identity became integrated rather than competing aspects of who I was. The homecoming was different from any I'd previously experienced. My family was waiting at the airport, but so were members of my professional community, teammates and commanders who wanted to welcome me back from a deployment they knew had been particularly challenging and significant. Seeing my parents interact comfortably with my military colleagues, watching Melissa ask informed questions about international relations and coalition operations, I realized that the integration I'd achieved personally had extended to my entire support network. My family now understood and appreciated my professional world, while my military community had come to know and respect my family background. During the weeks that followed, I was assigned to the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, working on training programs and tactical development projects that would influence how future SEAL operations were conducted. It was challenging work that required both operational experience and strategic thinking, combining everything I'd learned about tactics and leadership with broader understanding of how special operations fit into national security strategy. The position also provided opportunities to mentor younger operators, sharing the lessons I'd learned about resilience, leadership, and the importance of maintaining perspective during challenging assignments. Working with SEAL candidates and newly graduated operators, I was struck by how many of them were dealing with family relationships similar to what I'd experienced early in my career. Many came from backgrounds where military service wasn't well understood or particularly valued. They faced skepticism from family members who questioned their choices, dismissive comments about their career prospects, and pressure to pursue more conventional paths. Helping them navigate these challenges became one of the most satisfying aspects of my work. "The most important thing to understand," I told one group of candidates, "is that external validation, while nice when it comes, can't be the foundation of your commitment to this work. You have to find satisfaction and pride in the mission itself, in the standards you maintain, and the service you provide, regardless of whether anyone else understands or appreciates it." I shared appropriate details about my own family experience, not as a way to complain about past difficulties, but as an illustration of how authentic commitment to excellence eventually creates its own recognition. "Stay true to your values and your training," I told them. "Work hard, support your teammates, and maintain the highest standards regardless of who's watching. The recognition will come, but more importantly, you'll know that you've earned it." The training programs I helped develop incorporated lessons learned from international operations, cultural awareness training, and leadership development that reflected the evolving nature of special operations work. We were no longer just training tactical operators, we were developing strategic thinkers who could work effectively in complex international environments. During this period, I also began working on a master's degree in international relations through a Navy education program. The coursework provided academic context for the practical experience I'd gained through years of international operations, helping me understand The academic work was challenging in different ways, from operational assignments, requiring analytical skills and theoretical understanding that complemented but didn't replace the practical knowledge gained through experience. Balancing coursework with my training responsibilities and ongoing operational commitments required time management skills that pushed me beyond what I'd previously thought possible. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this period was the continued evolution of my relationship with my family. They'd become genuinely interested in my academic work, asking questions about my research and engaging with the ideas I was exploring in my studies. Our conversations now covered topics ranging from international security policy to cultural anthropology, discussions that would have been impossible when they saw my military service as simply a job rather than an intellectual and professional calling. Melissa had begun incorporating some of my research into her own work, using insights about post-conflict legal systems to better understand the challenges faced by veterans transitioning back to civilian life. She'd become an expert on military justice issues and was working with advocacy groups to reform policies that affected service members and veterans. I never realized how complex the legal issues surrounding military service could be, she told me during one of our regular phone conversations. Working with veterans has shown me that military law intersects with civilian legal systems in ways that create unique challenges for people transitioning between those worlds. Her growing expertise in military legal issues had led to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that were helping to bridge the gap between military and civilian understanding of service-related challenges. She'd become an advocate for policy changes that would improve support for veterans and their families, work that she found more meaningful than her previous focus on corporate law. The transformation in our relationship was complete, but not static. We continued to learn from each other, sharing perspectives and insights that enriched both of our professional and personal growth. The dismissive attitudes and competitive dynamics of our earlier relationship had been replaced by mutual respect and genuine collaboration. As I progressed through my graduate studies and continued my work with the development group, opportunities began to emerge for even greater responsibilities and challenges. I was being considered for assignment to joint task force positions that would involve working directly with other services and international partners on strategic planning and policy development. These opportunities represented the culmination of everything I'd worked toward since that first day in ROTC. From a teenager trying to find her own identity separate from family expectations, I'd developed into a strategic leader capable of contributing to national security decision-making at the highest levels. But perhaps more importantly, I'd learned that success wasn't just about individual achievement or even about proving critics wrong. True success came from finding ways to serve something larger than yourself while maintaining authentic relationships with the people who mattered most. The recognition I'd received at Melissa's wedding had been a turning point, but it wasn't the end of the story. It had been the beginning of a new chapter in which my professional accomplishments and personal relationships reinforced rather than competed with each other. Looking back on the journey from that engagement party where Melissa had dismissed me as just a soldier to the present moment, where she was a legal advocate for veterans, and I was preparing for senior leadership roles in strategic planning, I was struck by how much we'd both grown and changed. The young woman who had smiled calmly at her sister's condescending comment, knowing that vindication was coming, had become someone who no longer needed vindication because she'd found something more valuable. Genuine connection with family members who understood and supported her choices. The path from dismissal to recognition had required patience, persistence, and unwavering commitment to excellence. But the real reward wasn't the moment of recognition itself, it was the relationships and understanding that recognition had made possible. As I prepared for the next phase of my career, with its new challenges and responsibilities, I carried with me not just the technical skills and operational experience I'd gained through years of service, but also the knowledge that I was supported by people who truly understood the significance of that service. The girl who had been called just a soldier had become a woman whose service was recognized not just by her professional community, but by family members who had learned to see military excellence as one of the highest forms of civic contribution. And in the end, that recognition had created the foundation for relationships based on truth, respect, and mutual support. The journey had been worth every difficult moment, not because external validation was necessary for self-worth, but because it had led to authentic connection with the people who mattered most. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't about proving people wrong, it's about helping them see clearly enough to recognize they were wrong all along, and giving them the opportunity to grow into something better than they were before. My story didn't end with that moment of recognition at the wedding. It continued with years of building on that foundation, creating relationships and opportunities that were richer and more meaningful than any moment of vindication could have been. The recognition was just the beginning, the first step towards something much more valuable than proving a point, building a life where professional excellence and personal relationships supported and strengthened each other. And that in the end was the most complete victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.